Alright folks, here is the finished painting. And let me show you how I did this painting. Show you pretty much every stroke of this painting. So I started out with a 6x8 canvas panel, and I toned it with ivory black, and I just used some paint thinner to thin it down. And then I let that dry. I do a lot of those at one time, and I just let them dry over a few days or so. So the surface is completely dry, and now I'm using a small brush with some transparent oxide red, or if you're using Gamblin oil paint, it's transparent red earth. I think that's the paint that I actually used. And I'm using it straight from the tube. You can see there it's kind of a dry brushing effect. I'm not using any paint thinner. I'm just using it straight from the tube, so it's a little bit of thicker paint, drier paint. And I'm just using it to sketch out the composition here, some of the line work. And just getting an idea for shadows and light, what's going to be in shadow, what's going to be in light, and just placement of things on the canvas. Getting a sense for making sure everything's going to fit on there. Obviously, I'm doing this from a photo reference. I've been to this meadow plenty of times, taken lots of different photos. I've done sketches on location and stuff. So, I feel pretty confident about doing this one from a photo reference. But this initial stage, I kind of try to take it slowly. Spend 5 or 10 minutes at the most. At least for a landscape like this. If I'm doing a portrait or something, or a landscape that's a little more challenging, I'll take as much time as it needs. But for something quick like this, I can usually get it down in about 5 to 10 minutes. But definitely take your time. This is really one of the most important stages of a painting, because if you don't get the sketch right in the beginning and get things in the right place, things figured out, when you go to add color and add more paint, you're going to be spending a lot more time fixing things rather than just placing them where they actually need to go. And definitely, I've learned that from experience. And there was one landscape that I did that was a larger landscape, and I spent way much more time just fixing things rather than actually painting. So you definitely don't want to fall into that trap. So definitely take the time in the beginning to get the sketch down right, make sure you're happy with it, and then we move on to this stage, putting down some first layers of paint here, which these layers of paint that I'm putting on could be this could be the final layer right here. There's no reason to do multiple layers if you don't have to. So we're going straight into it. This is going to be a study in greens. There's so much green in this painting, and I believe this was a summertime painting, so it can be or spring, early summer, so there's gonna be a lot of green, and it's very tricky sometimes to get the greens right. With this one I'm using lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and I think cadmium red medium, or some kind of red similar to that, cadmium red light. So that's my palette for this painting, and transparent oxide red, of course, or transparent red earth. Very limited palette for this painting, I believe. So the thing that's going to make or break the greens in this painting is going to be the amount of red that I mix into the greens. That's going to be kind of the modifier for these greens, because there's nothing else to modify them other than the amount of blue or the amount of yellow, obviously. So this green here, right now it kind of looks like a pretty balanced green, maybe more on the yellow green side, maybe a hint of transparent red earth in there. So color is something you have to play around with and really just do a lot of paintings, and you'll kind of just go intuitively with the color mixing. But on a painting like this, I'll show you as I continue with this painting. Now I'm going to go into the sky, but once I get into the trees, I'll be able to really compare the greens on this canvas a lot better. And you'll probably see that the meadow is going to be a lot stronger green. Usually grass and things is going to be a lot stronger greens compared to trees and such. That's just a general statement. That's not in every case. All right, so now moving into the sky here, I'm going to do something interesting with this sky. So I'm starting out with a very ultramarine purple type of mix. So probably white with ultramarine blue, titanium white. And as it gets lower, now that what I'm moving into, I've added a little touch of yellow to the sky. And that's going to make it seem a little bit green. It's going to gray it down a little bit. But it's also going to give it a sense of atmosphere, a sense of depth in the sky. If you ever really look at the sky, usually as it gets closer and closer toward the horizon, you're going to see more yellow in it, more red in it. It might become more gray. Just with pollution and things nowadays, and just there's more layers of atmosphere to look through. And that's what ends up happening. You get more yellow and red in it, and sometimes you'll get this green tinge or kind of a light viridian color. So now I'm moving into the shadows now. And the reason I started out with that meadow green, because I felt like it was a very easy color to mix and to match. So I started out with something that I thought would be very easy, very simple to match, and that's what I did. I matched the value and the color very simply, and that's just intuitively where I started out with. Normally I start out with the shadows here like I'm doing, but I felt like doing the sky and the meadow first really helped me get a sense of the values, how light and dark to go. So now I'm moving to the shadows, and you can see it's a very bluish, cool green. And that's going to do is when I put on the light of the trees, it's going to make the lights seem very warm, because this is during the day. This is the sun shining. There's a lot of warm light happening. So some cooler shadow shapes on these trees. And the main reason they're cooler is because of the blue sky reflecting into these shadows, creating some cooler reflected lights and things. But basically I'm just, doing a dark value here. And I'm just having some fun with it, just filling in the canvas, blocking things in. This is just the first stage. I'm not using a whole lot of paint, but I am using a pretty good amount. I like using a good amount of paint. I like having the brush strokes show up and just having a real nice thick layer of paint on the canvas, for these smaller paintings at least. So now moving into the greens of the trees, and this green is very similar to the meadow, but you can really see a difference. There's a lot more red in it. It's more gray looking. It's toned down. It's not as saturated. And that's the subtlety that I'm talking about here. It actually, you could actually say it's a little cooler as well. It looks warmer, I think, because it's more grayed down, but it's also slightly cooler, I think. It can be difficult to try to say what's warmer and what's cooler. But I think the meadow has more blue in it. It's more of a cooler looking green. The trees now have more of a red, gray looking green, but it's definitely more subdued. And that's what's going to give it the realism, at least in my opinion. That's what gives it a slight bit of realism here is the saturation of the greens and also getting the value correct. So now I'm putting in some kind of shadow shapes here, and you can see shadows within the trees. Within the light area, it's very much lighter. I'm not going to put some very darks on the light side of the tree just because I want to maintain that lightness across the entire tree. So I really tried to separate the values here of light and dark, and you can see actually the dark shape of this painting. I've really tried to connect into one big dark shape. That was my goal. So that was something I looked at the scene, I looked at the photo, and I tried to simplify it. Simplify the dark into one big shape. And the lights, you can see they're almost one big shape. I mean, you could really, I think the viewer kind of connects them in their mind, when looking at them. But they are separated slightly, the trees that I'm working on now. But, when you see all of it together, that one dark shape really stands out and gives the contrast that this, painting needs, I think. So I'm just continuing to work on the light areas of this tree, and I'm kind of varying my brushwork here a bit, softening, making sure I'm like softening some of the edges, getting in some bushes and tree shapes. And it's also varying the value as well. Some areas I'm putting on some slightly darker paint. I'm lightening up some of the shadows here. Those shadows on the meadow would be pretty light because they're receiving a secondary, they're receiving a light source from the sky. So they have a lot of reflected light in them. So I have to be careful here because I don't want to get too detailed at this stage. So now I'm going in and I'm trying to soften some areas a bit, trying to have a transition. So I went back I darkened down that light value I was just using, and now I'm trying to get in some midtones here, kind of areas between shadow and light. And it just serves as a little transition, just to kind of soften the edge a bit. And I'm adding I'm making this more of a cooler green, I've decided, on this one tree. So it's a lighter and cooler green, and what I'm doing is I'm giving the scene more depth. So I'm pushing that tree that I'm working on back into the distance. And you'll see as the painting progresses that it really recedes into the distance there. And I'm also going to soften the edge. So by softening that top edge like I just did into the sky, that gives it kind of that depth, like showing that it's further away, it's more blurry, it's not as crisp, there's not a sharp edge. And I just did a mistake in the sky there, so now I'm just painting over that. Still fixing up the sky, fixing up some of the edges of the tree now. Now I'm using the sky color to cut into the tree, create some variety of edge, variety of shape along this tree, give it more of a tree-like look. And it also softens some areas of the tree and stuff, some of the edges. Trees are very soft, the edges of the trees. You have all these thousands and hundreds of leaves everywhere, and they just create a soft edge. It's not usually something that's very sharp, very harsh. Just try to think of it as like, okay, if I'm painting these trees, if there was a car like in the foreground, the edges of the car are going to be much more hard. They're going to be much more stiff, more crisp, and then the trees are going to have going to be very soft. They're going to have a lot of softness to their edges. So definitely pay attention to the edges, because that's really what makes, between the values and edges, that's what really, gets the realism across in a painting. Color doesn't really even matter all that much. If you get the value correct, the color doesn't really have to be realistic or anything. You can really have fun with the color as long as the value's right. Color doesn't really matter, but I go for more of a realistic look, so that's why I try to get, the greens in this scene pretty accurate as far as I'm concerned. And then I also took some liberties, some artistic expression, and I cooled down that one tree, gave it some depth to the scene. I'm not just using the photo, I'm not a slave to the photo. I try not to be, for the most part. I try to really compose the scene and change a few things here and there, but I do like to make it truthful to the scene as well, because this is a place that I come to a lot and I really love it. And, paintings like this for me are kind of an escape from my daily life. So when I look at these, it just reminds me of being there. And it's fun to capture something in real life, that means something to me. So now I'm painting in that pathway through the meadow. And this color, it's pretty simple. It's just a very light, transparent red oxide or transparent red earth and yellow for the most part. You can add in a touch of blue to gray it down if you need to. That's probably what I did with this one, but it's just a very light value. I'm just trying to create some soft edges and some soft pathways and stuff, and kind of vary my brush work, vary the lines. I'm varying the pressure as I paint. Some areas I'm pushing hard, putting more paint on the canvas. Other areas are getting a feather soft touch to soften things. Definitely play around with brush work and brush strokes and find out what you like. Do you like really detailed brushwork, or does brushwork not matter to you? You just put the paint on thickly and let the values and the colors, speak. Try to figure those things out, and that becomes part of your style. And really what I mean by like figuring out is being self-aware. So obviously, be in tune with what art you like and enjoy, but then also understand how you create, how you paint. My style, I still feel like I don't really have a style, but other people will look at my work and say that I definitely have a style. So your style is basically just do as many paintings as you can, and your own voice will come out, and the certain colors that you use over and over, you might be able to find a trend in that. You might be able to find a trend in how you use your edges or how you compose scenes. You kind of have to look for these, do a series of 20 paintings and try to find what stands out to you about them. Is it subject matter, colors? It could be a multitude of all these things, a variety of things. So anyway, just a little talk there about subject matter and style. So now I'm cleaning up these shadows, and I'm actually giving them a more realistic perspective. So rather than it looking like I'm hovering up above this meadow and looking down on these shadows, now it's more like I'm looking straight out into the meadow. So I'm changing the perspective. I hope that makes sense. If you guys know about perspective, the closer it gets to the horizon, the shorter and flatter it's going to look. It's not going to have this oval type appearance. So, and I'm also trying to give the appearance that the meadow is growing up. So this is tall grass in a meadow. So that's what I'm trying to show there. And now I'm going back in with some reflected lights here. So a value that's just slightly lighter than the shadows, adding in some reflected lights. I did that with the tree, that very, very tall tree all the way to the right of the canvas. I did that as well just a minute ago. Added in some reflected lights there. And I think that also brings some realism into this scene. And now I'm just bringing in just a little bit of midtones here. Just being aware of the transitions. Because, having a transition tone there, it's going to soften the edges and such. And here I'm kind of playing around, I think. I've been taking some liberties with this. So I'm cutting into these trees, and I'm using the sky that negative shape of the sky to cut into the trees, and I want it to point down to the pathway, kind of where the pathway is entering the forest. I'm kind of using the sky to my advantage, that cut in the forest to cut down, and then that's another way to get to that point of where I want you to be looking, where I want the viewer to look. So it's really subtle things like that that can really add some interest to your painting and really help the eye flow of the painting. You know, you got to be aware of where you want the viewer to be looking, what's the focal point of your painting. And my focal point is kind of, you know, that dark mass in the center. You know, I want people to follow the pathway into the forest. I want there to be like some kind of mystery around this, like what's in the forest, where does that pathway go? And here I'm signing the painting, but this is not the end. I sign it, and then I realize there's a little bit of work left. And this, I do this all the time. You know, sometimes I'll sign it prematurely, and then I'll go, okay, I want to touch up just a few things here. So this may look a little weird what I'm doing, but I'm giving some shadow to the meadow. So there's some shadows casting onto the trail, the meadow trail there, pathway. And like I said, this meadow is tall grass, so that's what I'm trying to show here by adding, you know, a little bit of shadows and just trying to create a little bit more light in the foreground by adding in a little bit of shadows. So just some final touches here on this painting. And here is the finished painting, finished work, and some close-ups, brushwork and things, and the final shot of the painting. Be sure to check out my other tutorial videos for drawing and painting. Also subscribe to see future episodes. Peace.